to Real Democracy Now! I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now! Is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. This episode is about Albert Dzur and Carolyn Hendriks' book, Democracy in Action, Collective Problem Solving in Citizens' Governance Spaces. This book considers a range of citizens' initiatives that solve complex problems directly rather than through advocacy and policy change. In this episode, you'll learn how grassroots citizens' initiatives are shaping modern democracy, often operating independently of traditional political and institutional structures. This episode explores real-world case studies, key features of citizen governance spaces, and their potential to influence public policy and democratic reform. Finally, I want to thank Nicole Curato for suggesting that I create a series of episodes on books, as well as the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance for their support for these episodes.
Welcome, Carolyn and Albert. Thank you very much for joining me to talk about your new book, Democracy in Action. I found it fascinating, and I think it's really interesting to think about that new area, probably not so much a new area, but a newly studied area. So look, I'm interested in how the book came to be. You mentioned that your collaboration began over 10 years ago. So how did this book project begin and evolve?
Yeah, thanks for having us, Vivek. I mean, this is sort of a collaboration that has been going on for about a decade, but it started fairly accidentally, and it was quite an exploratory process. I first met Albert. He was visiting the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. I'm based at the ANU, which is nearby, and I popped in to have a coffee and met Albert, and we started sharing stories about our empirical work at the time. And to our surprise, we sort of noticed that there were some common elements in some citizens' initiatives that we were looking at. And I mean, the thing that really kind of struck us at the time was that in these spaces that we were looking at, the citizens were leading the democratic work, so they weren't being elite-led. And these spaces were focused on problem solving. So they weren't just participation per se, they were actually doing effective policy work.
Yeah, and in the first few years of this collaboration, we were shooting emails back and forth, trying to get a grip on like what were the essential bits of these initiatives. So we'd be spotting these cases all over the place, and we'll talk about some of them with you here. Serenity Cafe in Scotland, which is a cafe run by former substance users, the mobile laundry in Australia, social work teams in the US. And we would, send an email saying, is this case a citizens governance space? It's got this thing and this thing and this thing, but it doesn't have this other thing. Do we count it as that? So this is a kind of an inductive process back and forth and back and forth. And we were finding these in newspaper articles. We were finding these in scholarly articles. Some of our students in their class projects were bringing them forward, and we'd sort of share these, and we'd have a kind of an archive and began to develop a more conceptual framework to say, this is a citizens governance space, and this is what it does, and so on.
And I guess at the time we started to realize that these are not new forms of citizen engagement or community organizing, but we were noticing that they were emerging in an era when people were deeply distrustful of both formal institutions, but also professionalised civil society organisation. And so while there was a growth in these other spaces of democratic engagement, particularly deliberative forms and lots of opportunities for citizens to participate, particularly in protest forms of political participation, we were looking at these spaces and thinking people are actively choosing to go into these spaces of practical governance work. And that fascinated us because they were fairly overlooked in the conversations around democratic reform at the time. And so while we recognise that a lot of these forms of citizen engagement have been around forever, citizens have been self-governing and self-organising to solve collective problems as long as humans have lived together in collective organisations, But we wanted to shine a light on what these spaces mean right now in an era when formal spaces and informal spaces of democracy are losing their appeal for citizens. So we drew on a lot of literatures from social entrepreneurship, public governance, in public policy, public sector management scholarship. And what we found across those very diverse literatures was that these spaces didn't really have a label, or they had many labels. That was the other thing we discovered. So sometimes they're called citizens' initiatives, sometimes they're called social enterprises. Everyday making is another term that Henrik Bang uses. Public work, Harry Boyd uses that term. And we felt that these concepts were drawing on particular aspects of these cases, but we wanted to look and kind of really conceptualize them as one group of forms of civil society that you could really shine a light on, and particularly look at the democratic aspects of them. So that was really what became very exploratory, and we started to then take shape and write initially some chapters, and then we decided to dive into writing a book which has about over 30 real world case studies in it. So the project never started like that. It sort of grew over time, I guess.
As you've talked about the concept of citizens' governance spaces, which you've developed to understand the democratic practices that you've described. I think it's in almost 30 or maybe a few more than 31 case studies from all around the world that you present in the book. So, Albert, you talked about things that were and weren't, and your questions about what was a citizens' governance space and what wasn't. How do you describe citizens' governance spaces, and how do they compare to other governance spaces, that may or may not involve citizens?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to point out is that these are in civil society, right? So that's where they're located. In the book, we have this definition of a citizens' governance space. It has five features. They are led and driven by citizens. They undertake practical governance work to address a collective issue. They do this in experimental, innovative, sometimes disruptive way. They engage inclusively with affected public, and they prefer to do this autonomously and congruently rather than sort of under the aegis of a public sector actor or a private actor or a conventional civil society organization. So you asked about how they were distinctive. I think one of the major distinguishing features is the fact that they do stuff. They produce things, they produce services, as opposed to advocating for some other entity to do that. So sure, they might have some element of an advocacy role, but they're coming together to do things, to produce services, rather than urging government to do that. I think the other thing that really caught our eye as a distinctive feature was their sort of flexibility or pragmatism about who they worked with. One thing that really struck us actually was the fact that they would work with private sector entities, which is not something we saw a lot with, say, social movement activism. So they'll work with the public sector, they'll work with the private sector, they'll work with conventional civil society organizations, but they really value their autonomy. Some are a little bit more antagonistic than others, but by and large, they're not antagonistic, and they are fairly flexible about who they're going to work with and work alongside. We use this term congruently to talk about the way that they're autonomous, but they're also willing to work with a state agency, work with a private firm, and so on. So I think that those are sort of two distinctive elements.
When I was doing my master's, one of the big, popular topics at the time was co-production. And how would we conceptualize these? They're sort of like community production, aren't they, really? Like, because they aren't,
Yeah.
It's not the government saying, hey, we need you to recycle or something like that. It's the community saying, we've identified this need.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, Nivek, I think the literature on co-production does talk about some aspects of what we're looking at. They often fall into this really small little category called community-led co-production. The most of the co-production literature and the examples that are drawn on to inform that literature tend to be state-led, or they're mutually sort of agreed upon. But what was very distinctive about the spaces that are in this book are really that they are initiated and driven and led by the citizens themselves. So the state is invited in. It's not the other way around, which tends to be the kinds of examples you find in that co-production literature.
Yeah, no, definitely. The co-production is government-led, most definitely. So I guess you've touched on it a bit, but I mean, how do citizens' governance spaces differ from traditional forms of civic engagement like activism and voting? You refer to activism and voting quite a lot throughout the book in terms of something that these aren't, I guess. And how do they also relate to the concepts like deliberative democracy or participatory governance models? You know, are they creating new paradigms? Where do you see it fitting within all those other models, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, you're just at the outset as a sort of a caveat. It's not like activists aren't part of these groups from time to time, right? So that's, we don't mean to make these distinctions kind of hermetically sealed. But in voting and in many forms of activism, the citizen is asking the official, is asking the regime to do something. In these spaces, in these citizen spaces, people are doing something themselves. So I think that is a distinction. And again, this is not zero sum. You can do activism, you can vote, and you can also do this this stuff in the citizen in space. So in terms of deliberative, democratic, and participatory governance models, I mean, here again, Carolyn and I come out of that sort of field, so to speak. We have great admiration for the scholars in that of those models, and we have both in our careers sort of noticed how they've really taken off in political systems all over the world at every level, right? Local, regional, and national. And I think that those sort of practical and scholarly efforts have shown what people can do and have shown what people are interested in. So they've really, I think, turned the corner. I mean, deliberative democratic theory, I think, has helped us turn the corner away from an earlier elite-centered democratic theory, and that's huge. That's been, and I think we're both sort of beneficiaries of all that. At the same time, deliberative democracy and participatory governance, as we sort of alluded to earlier, aren't really driven by the citizens themselves. These are I mean, there are some examples, right, of citizen movements utilizing these models, but by and large, they're fairly top-down, facilitated by officials, academics, NGOs. Citizens governance spaces are quite different in the sense that they're always citizen-led, right? They are always bottom-up. And I think another point worth making is that, and again, this is not necessarily criticism because they don't really set out to do this, but participatory governance and deliberative democratic forums don't really ask citizens to do anything. So they, help people reflect on their preferences and come together and exchange ideas, and that's really important. But for people who want to do something, they can leave a little bit of a gap, right? They can feel incomplete. We've had a good chat, over the last few hours. Now what? What's our action plan? Carolyn and I have been involved in a lot of these sorts of forums, and people will often come up, if we're part of the organizing team, what's next? What are we going to do now? So I think citizens governance spaces, they are thinking places like participatory governance and deliberative democratic forums, but they're also doing places. So I think that those are important distinctions.
I wonder though, like you talk about, I think in the book, about the potential for this citizen action to lead to government withdrawing. And my experience with deliberative processes is that normally in those, people are coming up with recommendations of things they want the government to do. And if the government did those things, then perhaps they wouldn't need to be taking action and they could be living their life. And certainly, I think some deliberative processes do a form of co-design. So I'm just sort of interested in, I suppose that leads quite nicely to my next question, which is about the prerequisites. What needs to be in place or what needs to be happening both in the community, I guess, and with the people that are involved to enable the development of these governance spaces? I know you're saying people want to do something, but I sort of wonder, is it they just want to achieve something? They could achieve it, or the government could achieve it, but if the government's not going to, they will.
Yeah, I mean, they're great reflections, Nivek, and also, I guess, just to distinguish further from sort of deliberative democratic forums, I mean, those mechanisms or designs emerged both from practice but also from normative theory about how things could be better. What we're conceptualizing here is not necessarily like a normative mechanism or this is how things need to be. We're observing practice, democratic practice, and shining a light on things that citizens are currently doing. So in the book, we explore some of the democratic attributes, but also some of the risks for democracy. So just to clear that up from the go-get. And I guess one of the risks is that these spaces don't emerge in all kinds of societies or in all issues. But the cases that we draw on sort of point to some of those prerequisites that you're asking about. And the first one is really a motivation. The citizens have to be motivated to self-organise and frustrated enough with the current dysfunction or concerned enough about the public problem at the heart of the issue to sort of self-organise and give up their time to do something about the problem. And those motivations can be because there's no state action, there's no functional policy program that's addressing the problem, or it could be that there is a state program, but it's woefully inadequate or that it's doing harm. So a lot of the initiatives we see in climate change or in substance abuse recovery sort of fit into that, where there is state-led programs, but there's the citizens that have self-organised a governance space want to see a different kind of solution or experimentation for a different way of addressing that issue. Sometimes they're trying to step into a void that's been created by sort of neoliberal tendencies or to marketise a particular way of solving a problem. And where the market has failed, citizens are stepping in to say, look, there's a better way of addressing this problem. And they sometimes can step into spaces where formalised civil society have put forward solutions. But again, citizens feel that approach might be tied to particular expectations for people. So this can come about, for example, when church groups or particular charities with particular ideological kind of commitments will only offer services to particular kinds of groups of citizens. So that's the first kind of one that we kind of notice as a prerequisite. There has to be a motivation. The second sort of feature really has to be that the citizens have to know enough about the problem and the governance context. So it's one thing to care about an issue, but it's another thing to have enough knowledge about how the system works and what's dysfunctional about it and what therefore could be a better way of addressing the issue. So these citizens are often embedded in the problem-making space because they've got children or they've got loved ones or they see someone near them involved in the current system and they can see its dysfunction. So they're kind of what has been termed in other literatures sort of expert citizens. They know a lot about the shop front, how it works right down on the policy sort of floor, particularly for people receiving services. The third sort of feature, I guess, is that there's someone with a skill set, particularly in leading another group. So it's not just about one maverick person, but that they're willing to self-organise, create a group, a collective, to then work as a team on something. So that is quite different to a kind of a philanthropic, one person funder. And the final kind of feature, I guess, is that they've got resources. So you might have a group of citizens that want to do something about a problem, but they have no funding or no knowledge or no people to help them do that. So they need a certain level of resources. And I guess the partnership thing, which is what we can talk about a bit further, but most of these spaces don't do it alone. They reach out for support from either private sector partners or governments or civil society organisations. So they may initiate the problem-solving space, but in order for them to be sustained and effective at problem-solving, they form partnerships. So these kind of features don't always come together. That's, I guess, speaks to some of those democratic questions you were asking before.
When you were talking through some of the prerequisites, and you were mentioning some of the issues that lead to people wanting to create their own solution. I'm not sure where you see this particular one fitting. The funeral service one seems to me more to be about market failure than anything else. And I just wondered, in that sense, it's a bit different to some of the others. I mean, am I right in seeing that, or do you think it's the same?
Absolutely. I think that, so this is a citizen governance space that has emerged in the Australian context to kind of address what a group of citizens felt was the privatisation of the funeral sector in Australia, and particularly not offering enough choice around different types of funeral services, and also being, it's a very opaque industry about where the costs are. So a citizen group kind of formed to try and offer a lower budget and also a more care-centred approach to funeral provision. But they are absolutely addressing a market failure, but it's also about the regulation of that market. So some of the policy interventions and the experiential knowledge that citizen governance space has generated through its offering of this alternative way of doing funerals has then been fed back in through parliamentary inquiries about the funeral sector, and particularly around pricing transparency. So yes, it's addressing a market failure, but it's also speaking to how governments then regulate those markets.
Yeah, and I think we'll come back to the impact of these sort of spaces on public policy. So you've sort of talked me through the prerequisites. I know in the book you identify some downsides or potential downsides to citizens' government spaces. Some of them are sort of ones that apply across democracy, which is like lack of inclusion and reproducing social inequalities. Did your case studies give you any guidance on how to address these challenges?
Well, we look at, I guess, some of the democratic attributes and the risks that these sorts of spaces pose across a range of policy areas. We focus in the book, and we purposely selected cases that fit into, I guess, the good story, because we're interested in what can we learn from those that show democratic attributes. But at the front of the book, we look at the spaces that we haven't selected, and Albert can talk a bit more about that. But the features that we sort of see consistently across those sorts of spaces that we see good functional democratic work sort of emerging, there's 4 kind of key features. The first one is we see a capacity to share power. So they often have either a formal or informal way of sharing decision-making power at the centre. So it's not just one person driving through an idea. And so that can be formal kind of committees or boards, or it might be more informal down towards sort of a peer support approach. The second feature is that beyond that, they're giving voice to members and other participants in the space. So they're offering opportunities, whether through voting or through participatory forums that they themselves run and convene, to bring in the perspectives of their members. So if it's a cooperative, they might run, a survey, or they might run a participatory process to get particular views on a decision. So that's a bit different to the oversight boards. The third feature, I guess, is that they often are looking at building capacity within both the members, but also the clients, if you want to call them that, or the people who are receiving the services that they're offering. So, for example, in the laundry case that Albert mentioned, that's a citizen governance space that's set up to try and address, I guess, or provide people living on the street in Australia with some basic hygiene services, so washing of clothes, and increasingly things like offering them public showers or other services, and the mobile way. So they're going to where the homeless people are. And beyond that, these groups, for example, are also offering opportunities for people on the street to have conversations, to possibly pick up some skill sets. So there's a building of capacity of often people who are quite highly marginalised from other services. The fourth one is really around, and this is where it dovetails with advocacy. A lot of these groups are also looking at outreach. They do a lot of campaigning in the sense of we're providing the broader community with information about the public problem and what can be done about it. So this is sort of open days, information events. They might run field trips. So it's a more communicative, informing role that they play. So these are different sort of democratic attributes that we've kind of uncovered. Albert, I don't know if you want to say something more about the inclusion aspect.
Yeah, I mean, like Carolyn was saying, many of these groups do have participatory elements integrated into their, organizing modes. And many also are involved in a lot of community outreach. At the same time, participation isn't the goal. The goal is this other whatever it is, this other end or service. So yeah, that's one piece. But on inclusion, we did deliberately focus on a number of groups that targeted marginalized people, and in fact, I would actually call them sort of hyper marginalized people. So the question of inclusion, whether these groups include folks, really has to do in those kinds of cases with how involved can they be in the running of the group, right? And that is something that is worth paying more attention to, is how can you shift in these spaces from serving or helping a hyper marginalized citizen to incorporating them into the work of the group. On the specific issue of like reproducing inequalities, that's been something that's been on our mind throughout this project, because it's a common critique, and one that we are sympathetic with, of informal action, that it doesn't suffice, right? It's not enough to solve problem. You really do need the state, right? And it's important not to give the state an out. And another aspect of this is that these spaces could be biased or skewed towards those social groups who are more resourced than others. So, we recognize that as an issue, but at the same time, I think we think that it misses out on the varied ways that people can contribute. Some people can contribute as members, others can contribute as in more substantive ways as facilitators or leaders, and people can step up whenever and however they can. And evidence from studies of informal volunteering show that kind of informality and flexibility is really attractive, especially to marginalized people, that where they feel more comfortable in these spaces than in more professionalized NGO spaces or conventional civil society charity type organizations. And we saw that during the COVID pandemic in mutual aid organizations. We drew from some studies in the UK of mutual aid organizations during COVID who managed to do their work in ways that fostered norms of mutualism, a kind of collective self-help, rather than the mode of helping. We're the helpers, you're the helped. So inclusion, inequality, these are big issues, very big issues, and we don't think that there's like a perfect solution to these, but we don't think that just because these are informal spaces that they necessarily reproduce social inequality and exclusion.
Carolyn, the example you gave of the laundry and the sort of the benefits of the people talking to each other and so on, it sort of reminded me of the emancipatory pedagogy in a sense. And I just wondered to what, and that sort of fits with your idea about providing for self-help, I guess, without necessarily, taking away responsibility from the state. Did you get a sense that whether, using the language or not, that emancipation was in the minds of people that were doing this self-governance?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an effect of the governance. But as Albert mentioned before, the main primary sort of focus of these groups is around that problem solving, the substantive issue, and getting some experimentation and some solutions that work on the ground. And the democratic or the participatory aspects of it and the capacity building are kind of almost sort of byproducts, but it really depends on the initiative. Like if we go back to Orange Sky Australia, Orange Sky Laundry as it was originally known, the founders of that, on one level, yes, they began as an organisation that wanted to provide mobile laundry services to people living on the street, because that was a small thing that they could do, and they thought that was also about offering dignity to people who are on the street. Just having clean clothes is something that makes us feel better. But in the process, and this gets to kind of the experimental aspect of these spaces, they started to realise that actually the clean clothes, the substantive thing, was kind of yes, that was why people were coming, but the bigger value that they started to see people coming to them, the people living on the street, was the conversations that they were having while they were waiting for the washing to be done. So it takes about an hour, 2 hours, depending on the washing machine. And so these people who were living on the street, who were largely isolated from community, were starting to have conversations with other volunteers and, the people running the mobile van. And that itself became a very powerful emancipation, in your words, but an opportunity for an opening around a much broader issue, which is social isolation. So I guess the seed for these projects starts in something very practical, but they can move into that more emancipatory or even sort of empowerment space over time. But I don't think they start with a democratic or participatory goal in mind, typically, unless they're deeply frustrated at the top-down way of delivery of something.
Yeah. Did you have anything to add there, Albert?
Well, only to add on this idea, and I don't want to put it too strongly, but there is a kind of allergy to ideology that we noticed in some groups, right? So, and I know there are, mutual aid groups that have an explicitly anarchist focus, right? For whom the, sort of emancipatory label would really be energizing. But there are a lot of people who would be distracted or actually a little bit repelled by those terms, right? They just want to help out. They see people living on the street and they seem miserable, and they have time and they have some resources and they want to help out in some way. And so Orange Sky Laundry, allows them a way to help to do that. So, but if Orange Sky had this anarchist logo and the emancipatory flag, whatever that is, I think that would be, distracting. So I don't want to put this too strongly, because obviously ideas and concepts matter to people, but we noticed a stronger theme of sort of pragmatism and flexibility and the sort of shunning of these big labels in the work of a lot of these groups.
Look, and I think this discussion leads in nicely to what I'd like to ask you about next, and that is, you mentioned that a number of the citizens' governance spaces have had a broader impact on public policy. And I suppose, I'm assuming based on what we've said so far that they didn't necessarily have that as a goal, although some of them might have. What do you see as the differences between citizens' governance spaces that have impacted on policy and those that didn't? Is it just intention, or what actually either allows or stops that impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously policy impact comes in lots of different forms, and that ranges from sort of reframing the problem or the issue from the outset right through to, having a profound impact on legislation or the service delivery that's delivered by a large state organisation. So that, in between those two extremes are lots of other ways these spaces can have policy impact. And I guess the motivation for some of these groups, it might be aspirational and they want to change the whole way in which, a particular public problem is addressed. But I think, again, going back to that sort of pragmatic point, that the resourcing and the manpower, if you like, the labour that's available for this group is usually very small. And so they start realistically with a kind of bite-sized experiment or an initiative, working in ways they can. But what we've noticed, I guess, is that it's the experimentation that they then unleash, and if successful in problem-solving terms, if the state or the civil society actors start to notice the efficacy of that work, then things really grow and snowball. So, for example, Nivek, you're probably quite familiar with the land care model in Australia. I mean, this began in the 1970s with one small group in northeast Victoria here in Australia that formed because they were concerned. These were landholders on rural properties concerned about dry land salinity, and they formed a small group that then got a bit of funding from the Victorian government, and it sort of merged and morphed into more of a conservation/land management model, which then many farming communities around Australia started to self-organise based on that experience. And it's had lots of different variations with state and federal agencies coming in and taking over. It's a long story, but you've had almost 50 years now of land care groups, and there's now 5,000 of them around Australia. So these range from very bottom up groups, and sometimes they're quite sort of state directed if the community capacity is not there. But that's an example, I guess, of long sustained impact where the original group wouldn't have had that in mind, but it kind of grew into that because the potential of these localized approach was more, people could see that we can do local work, but collectively we can do a lot around conservation in Australia. I mean, sometimes these groups start just by the desire for a local group or an individual household to have a better service. So one of the cases we look at in the book is an Indonesian initiative that was started by a couple of students who started to see that there was a lot of poor access to internet services around Indonesia in the late sort of 1990s. And so some citizens pooled their resources and started to create their kind of low-cost community-based internet provision. And this was completely illegal, but they were so successful at providing this local, cheap, community-based internet that these networks kind of popped up all around parts of Indonesia that eventually the government had to kind of succumb and loosen the very tight laws around internet provision. And so that's an example where the innovation sort of drove legislative reform because it was sort of out of control, but also it was more equitable what was happening. They're two examples, I guess, of policy change at that more extreme kind of,
Yeah, and sometimes these citizen spaces can disrupt conventional policy approaches. So we mentioned this Serenity Cafe in Scotland, a cafe run by former substance users who were committed to abstaining from use. And they ran the cafe as a business, right? It was, supposed to make a profit. It wasn't just a social service, but it was a place that they could hang out and socialize and have fun in the evening when all around them, this being Scotland, people are out and about at bars and drinking a lot. And that's the culture that's all around them. And conventional substance use policy in Scotland at the time stressed harm reduction and actually downplayed abstinence as a goal, well, quite heavily. Like abstinence was, really the wrong way to go. But the folks at Serenity Cafe were really proud of their abstinence, and they're working really hard to provide this space where they could get the support to do that. So by showing through the success of the cafe and the success of what they were doing at an individual level, they're sort of disrupting the policy assumptions of the folks who were pushing a sort of a harm control perspective. Another example that we talk about in the book, Baltimore Community Conferencing or Restorative Justice Space, it would be another example of quiet policy disruption. So Baltimore Community Conferencing does community-based restorative justice conferences to deal with interpersonal disputes, minor harms, neighborhood issues, to prevent them from becoming criminal justice issues, right? To prevent the police from getting called, and then the prosecutors, and then the judges, and so on. So Baltimore Community Conferencing isn't doing the typical sort of social movement stuff of lobbying the system to make it more restorative. It is itself doing more restorative stuff and preventing that stuff from entering the criminal justice system. So it means by doing its work and doing more of that work, it means that a neighborhood problem gets solved without that thing going on a neighbor's son's criminal record, preventing that person from getting a job in the future. So in both of those cases, sort of Baltimore Community Conferencing and Serenity Cafe, this sort of quiet policy disruption is showing how possibly more effective and less harmful way of doing governance work is possible. So the explicit aim is for them to do more work, for the state to do a little less of what it does as a kind of indirect or implicit aim.
Okay, thanks for that. And I suppose this goes back to an earlier discussion we had. When we compare citizens' governance spaces to other governance spaces, and I suppose I'm thinking in particular of collaborative governance, but there could be others, how can governments and private sector actors, and I suppose civil society, support these citizen spaces without undermining their independence? And should they even have a role, or only have a role if they're invited?
Yeah, it's a great question, Nivek, because these spaces don't exist in isolation. They're often coming up against lots of other forms of citizen engagement and activism, and opportunities that are led by the state to do collaborative governance. So it is, as you know, quite an ecosystem out there on any given policy issue. And these spaces, when we look at them, they take different pathways. Some of them need the support of private and public actors for resourcing, and as Albert mentioned, they do this quite flexibly. Sometimes they hand the work completely over. Sometimes they set up more of a co-production kind of space where they're doing it together. And sometimes what we observed is that they actively say, we don't want to have anything to do with particularly the state, because they find that the state agencies get in the way. So there's quite a variety, I would say, and it depends on the group and the kind of issue they're trying to wrestle with. What we do sort of end with in the book is some suggestions for state and private actors about how they can better support these groups. I mean, the first suggestion is that this work that citizens are doing in problem solving needs to be recognised and valued. And I see, certainly in parts of Australia, I see governments at all levels, local, state and federal, starting to really do this, particularly in areas where trust in government agencies is very low. So if we think about Indigenous public policy, rural and regional public policy, where it's the community that has far more trust in itself than in some sort of external public agency. And that's often because of years, decades, centuries of dysfunction and sometimes a lot of harm, say in the case of Indigenous public policy. So I guess the first step is to really getting public and private actors to recognise this work and value it, and particularly not just valuing that the community are coming together, but they're offering a sort of experimental and an innovative way of addressing the problem. So this is where what we're talking about in these spaces is quite different from deliberative and or participatory spaces where the citizens might come up with a set of recommendations that then the state would sort of consider. What we talk about, and we have a whole chapter dedicated to this, is around knowledge, is that in these spaces there's an enormous amount of experimental and experiential knowledge is generated. And you see this in Indigenous public policy in parts, not all, in Australia, where the state is recognising that in successful community-led initiatives, a lot of knowledge is generated on other ways of dealing with problems in these communities as they understand them. So it's a kind of not just about recognising that communities are leading work, but that the work they're doing could be replicated or could add value elsewhere. The other thing I think is also about, you use this word support, and I think that's absolutely the one that we would also use, rather than that the government's coming in to control or to kind of regulate. So we all know instances where communities have led an initiative and government has come in, well-meaning to come in to provide resources, but the timing's wrong, or it's sort of paternalistic. So I guess having that flexibility, and I've seen this in some spaces in Australia here, where the government actors have to almost step back and allow the community group to have their own autonomy, and the state actors are participating, but they're not leading it. There's a tendency, I think, for some public officials to want to take over, and that is the sort of the dance that has to happen, where they step back and see that if they get too involved, then the group loses its own internal legitimacy and public legitimacy. And the final thing, which is really around that autonomy and agency, is really just to stop thinking they have to lead it and control it, and think about other ways, like they might become the funder or the facilitator, or we talk a little bit about brokerage, how the state can and private actors can become kind of a facilitator of connecting others up, but they don't need to be the ones that drive it. So this is a lot of rethinking around funding arrangements and risk management. And I think one of the things that we heard from the community groups or the spaces, the citizens themselves that are inside these spaces, that they feel like they need support with, is particularly working with for the private sector. So increasingly government agencies are offering communities training workshops in writing grants or in working with government. But what we heard was that the new frontier is really private sector partnerships. So, for example, in the community energy space where communities are leading renewable energy projects, they find themselves working with the so-called poles and wires guys, the big organisations, corporations that distribute and sell energy. And some communities feel like they don't have the skill sets or capacities to work with such large corporations. So they're the kinds of skills, I think, where the government, for example, could come in and help communities build their capacities in negotiating and partnering with private sector actors.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's so much, literature around public-private partnerships, and it's such a fraught area. I can imagine that, this is just on a micro scale, but nonetheless. Albert, is there anything you'd like to add there before I get to my final question?
No, I mean, I think Carolyn pointed out we have a chapter on knowledge, and I think that that's something to underscore since throughout this conversation we've talked about them as doing spaces, but I think that they're also knowledge creating spaces. And it was really striking to me how they often had linkages with groups, even little bitty groups in rural areas had connections with other bitty groups in other areas all over the world, and they were talking and they were sharing information and sharing material, and they were thinking differently. So I think that something that can often be missed, the fact that citizens can be knowers too. And just because they know things in a different way than government, that doesn't mean it's less important. It's not, and it doesn't mean that the government can't learn from citizens. So, there are a lot of terms that are used to describe citizen knowledge, and they're not derogatory necessarily, but they also sort of distinguish between like official ways of knowing and citizen ways of knowing, right? So common sense or practical, ground level, right? We want ground level information from people. We'll do the hard thinking, but we'll get your ground level sense of. And so I think these groups, by the kind of creative ways that they approach stuff, disrupt those kinds of fixed understandings of what good knowledge is. So just to sort of bring
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So look, my final question is a sort of broader one, and that is, what lessons do you think can be drawn from citizens' governance spaces to inform broader democratic reform?
Yeah, I think we've sort of alluded to these points in our conversation here, but one certainly is this idea that there's more capacity for action and like we've been saying, for knowledge creation from citizens, from organized citizens, than we commonly think in academia, in government, in mainstream civil society. And I think that what we can do as scholars and what one of the hopes of the book is to sort of adjust our awareness of this, to look at these local groups, these informal, imperfect, but also creative and sometimes quite effective groups that are doing this new work and bringing these new ideas forward. So we wanted the book to sort of capture this field of civic action that's not new. As Carolyn pointed out early on, this has been going on forever. It's not new, but it hasn't really been put up on the agenda along with these other forms, like you said, participatory governance or co-production or whatever. So we wanted to sort of put it forward as something worth taking a closer look at and unpacking a bit more. So that's the sort of scholarly side. But on the more citizen side, we wanted to underscore that this is a kind of participation that's open to everyone, that you don't need a degree, you don't need a certain level of income or a certain status to be involved in doing some really useful work. And you don't have to wear a label saying, I'm an activist to do this kind of work. You don't have to be an insider to do this kind of work. You can contribute on your own terms. You can contribute quietly. And I think that that's something Carolyn and I found quite compelling, right? That these groups were groups that attracted people who weren't being attracted to formal political activity. They weren't being attracted to conventional voluntary civil society organizations. They chose these because they could participate on their own terms. So I think that's sort of the citizen side of the book, is to make people aware of opportunities where they live to contribute their own unique skills, their own sort of idiosyncratic abilities. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess just adding on onto that is there is rising skepticism, I think, within citizens around the world, not just towards formal institutions and democratic organizations and parties, etc., political parties, but also some of the forms of civil society organizing. So large protests and sort of extreme politics that might be labeled as such. And so there's a sort of sense sometimes, I think, that we saw in some of these groups is that people wanted to participate in problem solving in ways that wasn't antagonistic, but it also wasn't expecting a lot in terms of formal engagement played in more informal ways. And so I guess the next step from here is to really look at what is the capacity for these spaces to sort of form constructive bridging spaces where different types of citizens with different value sets come together. That would be the next project from here, to really start to think about empirically, are these spaces of a sort of enclave engagement, or to what extent are they sort of offering a lot of diverse citizens to come together and focus in and around one issue, but it's across ideological and other kinds of divisions. So that's an open question. I think we saw elements of both of those in our work. So that's what we hope the book will stimulate ongoing research, particularly empirical research that tries to look at more of these kinds of spaces, particularly the good and the bad.
I'm going to throw another question at you, and I know it wasn't something I've given you any notice of, more of a comment from me, and see what you think. As you know, Carolyn, being one of my PhD supervisors, I use democratic functions as a framework in my PhD, and I think it can apply in a lot of places. And when I think of applying it to these citizens' governance spaces, they sort of tick a lot of boxes. I guess one of the boxes that they don't tick as clearly to me, and I know you do touch on it in the book, is accountability. So would you mind saying something about accountability?
Yeah, I mean, Albert, I can have a go, and if you want to come in. Yeah, I think there's accountability on different levels to think about here, because there's the accountability of the people who are in the group. So being accountable in terms of power sharing and being inclusive in that way. But then there's accountability, I guess, to those who are maybe at the center of the problem. So if it's a group that's trying to offer an alternative service to a hyper-marginalized group, people living on the street or substance abusers, etc., then the question is, what levels of accountability does the group provide to that cohort? And to me, I guess it comes back to both whether they're using the services and also the extent to which that broader public is being able to be included in some of the decision making. How is that population coming in and having a say and shaping the kind of problem solving that's going on? So that would differentiate a group for me that was not particularly accountable, that would just come in and offer a solution to a marginalized population that needs helping. That's the sort of difference between, say, a charity model per se, or top-down charity model, and one where people are being accountable to that group. I guess if they're taking public funds and even private funds, there's accountability to also the partners. But I think there's more than enough sort of infrastructure out there around those forms of accountability. I think it's really, for me, it's about the accountability to the people that are being offered the services and also the broader public. So that's, I guess, what I would say around accountability.
Yeah. So I would just sort of piggyback on what Carolyn was saying about the internal structures, that, you could use the term proxy accountability. Like, they don't want to mimic formal political accountability, but nevertheless, you could have a kind of a proxy in terms of there being participatory norms within the organization. There can be ongoing dialogue with people in positions of state power, and therefore, again, sort of proxy accountability. If they're getting public funding, like Carolyn says, there's another way of proxy accountability. But another thing that we've noticed is this sort of just do it mentality, right? And you see this from like in the wildfire cases in Australia, that the citizens groups were just getting out there and doing the work, right? I mean, they're out there doing the work before the state showed up. And I think this sort of just do it approach leads to what you could call a kind of a market share accountability. Like if they're letting us do it, then we're accountable. If, to connect to the restorative justice work, if more people are coming to us, if we're doing more business over time, that means we're accountable. I don't know if that like satisfies sort of strict normative ability, but I think that if you have pieces of all these different forms of accountability, I do think you solve some of the problems that people have with informal collective action.
Yeah, I mean, when Carolyn was talking about the laundry example, it made me think about that sort of like in a market accountability. If they want to use our service, if more people use it, then that suggests that what we're doing is good. And that's a different form of accountability, isn't it?
The other aspect of that market accountability, which I think is interesting, is that a lot of the groups we looked at, the bigger ones, they would produce annual reports. And so a lot of, I guess that's about them collecting and evidencing their impact. And that is also about them attracting particularly private sector funders. So Orange Sky Laundry / Orange Sky Australia, they do a lot of collating of hours on the street, number of loads washed, laundry washed, and a number of volunteers. And so sort of evidencing the growth of their organisation and the distribution of their impact. And all of that then is marketised, if you like, or used as collateral to sort of attract further private funding. Whether small-scale groups can scale up like this, it's a question, because it's not really in their capacity, because there's a lot of administrative work and marketing work that goes into putting all that sort of material together. But for those larger groups that are really attracting public funding and private funding, I think they do try to produce some public visibility of their work and where the funds are going to.
Yeah, and I think it probably would depend on the type of service and the type of, I guess, gap they're filling. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that. Was there anything that you wanted to say about the book that you haven't had a chance to say?
Albert, did you want to say something about the cover? Because that has a story.
It's this wonderful graphic artist, Jeff McFetridge. And what sort of attracted us to it is the ways that as people are working, they're kind of sharing ideas, they're coming together. And there's a kind of like the sort of Matisse dancers, the famous Matisse sort of cutout dancers.
Oh, it's lovely.
Like the sort of merging of people, temporarily. They're not necessarily coming together for forever. They'll break up and go off to their own lives, but for the moment, they're doing something together and they're sharing.
It's lovely.
The only other thing that we could talk about, Nuvek, which is a very common criticism, which I think some of your audience members may have, which is the quick shortcut, which is that this is just offloading. This is just, we sort of mentioned it a little bit, but we could talk just a tiny bit about what's your response? Aren't these citizens just picking up stuff that the state should be doing? And that work, and the more they do of that, the more it legitimizes the state just offloading and offloading.
I think from my perspective, if the government does withdraw, then that's obviously a bad thing. But I like the idea of a multifaceted service delivery. I would imagine even if the government was delivering some services, that there would be value in citizens also delivering some, give them a sense of impact. The problem is that the government does like to just move out when they think someone else can cover. That's your challenge, isn't it, I guess?
Yeah. But I mean, I think there are areas, at least in Australian public policy, where the state wants to lean in and do more, and they're under political pressure to do so. Like I'm thinking in Indigenous politics. But they have learned, I think some areas of the public sector have learned. Unless some of these complex problems are led and owned by Indigenous people themselves, then programs won't have the legitimacy and the buy-in and the effectiveness that a state program would. So you see this in sort of land management, in some areas of social policy in Indigenous communities. So there are lots of horror stories around Indigenous policy in Australia and programs that have done harm. But I do think there's also a lot of successful programs that aren't well documented, that you can kind of dig up and find that actually when the community themselves have led an initiative and then they've had support sort of underpinning that, you get a lot more effective policy outcomes and ownership of that issue, and particularly if it can be sustained. So I think
those examples, you're looking at the government not stepping out, but partnering and certainly funding. I think it comes back to your comment earlier about the challenges. I mean, I've run government grant making programs, and the rules can be so bureaucratic and so complex that, you spend half your time just managing the reporting and the rules and not delivering. So, because I don't sort of think of, if the government commissions something or funds it, I don't sort of think of that as privatisation or communityisation. I think of it as more like a partnership. But I think the challenge for the government, particularly with Indigenous, is that they still want to have so much control as a result of their money, don't they? I mean, it is that lack of respect for Indigenous communities.
A related issue is this issue of being small, the small scale of these organizations. And we frequently came across this sort of pressure to scale up. What are you doing to scale up? And I think that over the course of the project, we became less sympathetic to that pressure to scale up. The more we get around in why people were motivated to join these groups, the more we realized that, well, it was the small scale of it, the fact that they were making a difference sort of where they lived or their area. And I think that there's something to that. There's something to the authenticity of the action, of the autonomy of the act. They're not being told what to do. So should there be more of these? Yes, the good ones, for sure. But should they be like little franchises of the most successful versions of them? I think that it would really drain some of the energy actually out of them if they were sort of cookie cutter versions of them all over the place. So
and that's the involvement of government, isn't it? They like cookie cutter.
Exactly.
We also came across cases where the organisation or the group of citizens had intentionally decided not to scale because the services that they were providing, so this was with a particular organisation that was offering employment services to people with cognitive and physical disabilities, and they had the opportunity to grow and grow and grow and grow, and they felt that if they grew too large, they couldn't offer the really bespoke inclusion of the people that they were trying to find employment for. So it's also recognition that there is a way in which these organisations or groups work, particularly because they're doing practical work, that if they get too big, they can't do the nimble work that sometimes they are able to do. That's not with all of the groups we found, but some of them have intentionally said, look, if we get any bigger, we can't do what we want to do.
Yeah. Your example of land care, I've got land care groups where I live in the north of Sydney. Got a life of its own, hasn't it?
We reflect pretty critically on land care because it has had periods where it has been completely state-led and sort of co-opted, and then sort of there've been resistance to that. We use it as a case to demonstrate both explosion of scale but also where congruence gets a little bit out of whack, and the group that originally formed it possibly didn't see it having so much involvement with the state. Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.